The world Lucille now inhabits was once the setting for the popular dating action RPG, Alterna Fantasy. It was praised as a masterpiece, lauded for its intricate world building and deep system mechanics. Yet despite its success, many players shared one major point of dissatisfaction regarding the game's structure. The ultimate complaint centered on the utter lack of presence and charisma from the final antagonist. Duke Furashil Central, the alleged true mastermind, appeared only at the very end, only to be instantly and tragically defeated. Fanbooks later revealed that the Duke's crucial backstory was cut during development, leaving him a hollow plot device. Now Lucille, the reincarnated player, found himself trapped inside this very world, destined to be executed by the heroines. The young noble understood that if the Duke remained a weak final boss, his own execution was inevitable. But the aspiring villain, who unexpectedly possessed immense magical talent, realized he had the means to change the narrative. The goal was clear. Klaus Renford would use his accidental heroism to force Duke Furashil into becoming the powerful antagonist this world desperately needed. The reincarnated player Lucille now occupied the body of the minor noble Klaus Renford. This new life meant only one thing: execution by the heroines, just like the original Klaus. But the aspiring villain quickly realized something crucial about his new existence. While reviewing estate matters, the steward Oliver inquired about his lord's unusual silence. "It is nothing," the young lord replied, requesting a moment to think in solitude. The loyal steward, who also served as his education advisor, promptly withdrew. He had been prepared to simply accept his fate as a destined mob villain. However, the original Klaus possessed immense, untapped potential hidden deep within. By integrating the memories of the original noble, Lucille gained access to this powerful inheritance. The aspiring antihero began practicing, quickly realizing his spells were significantly stronger than expected. The aspiring villain started with basic sword swings, finding his movements awkward at first. The reincarnated player focused, recalling the inherited muscle memory of the original noble. After only a few repetitions, his form sharpened instantly, revealing a terrifying latent talent. Combining meta-knowledge with Klaus's innate magic control resulted in an absurdly powerful fireball on his first try. Lucille tested other spells, each one manifesting with significantly greater force than the original Klaus's memories suggested. Taking a moment, the young lord paused his training to examine his new appearance in the mirror. He realized the aesthetic appeal of his current body was also far superior to that of a minor villain. "How often do you see a minor villain with this kind of visual appeal?" he mused internally. The protagonist confirmed that merging his information with Klaus's potential unlocked truly immense power. It was at this moment the aspiring antihero made a crucial decision regarding his future. The reincarnated player swore he would not repeat the mistake of his past life, dying from overwork. If the only flaw in Alterna Fantasy was its hollow final boss, then Lucille would replace him with a charismatic villain worthy of the climax. The aspiring antihero declared he would start from step 1, accumulating evil deeds to become a true charismatic tyrant. For the sake of his objective, the young noble decided he would not be picky about the means he employed. Now, the strategic villain needed to determine the best course of action to kickstart his new career path. He recalled the Renford family's already terrible reputation, established by the original Klaus and his parents before their demise half a year ago. The original Klaus, raised by wicked nobles, was nothing more than a selfish, self-centered small fry. While the circumstances of the mob character were tragic, Lucille found he had no real sympathy for the boy's personality. However, the existing bad reputation of the Renford name was a resource he could certainly exploit. His strategic planning was interrupted by a knock, as his loyal steward Oliver informed him that dinner was ready. Lucille settled at the opulent dining table, ready to enjoy one of his few remaining pleasures. The chef arrived, presenting the covered dish and noting that Klaus Renford always demanded the most extravagant cuisine. The minor noble nodded in satisfaction, anticipating the rich flavors. As the cover was lifted, the protagonist paused, wondering exactly what delicacy lay before him. The chef announced the main course, a rare cut of red dragon liver. Hearing the name, Lucille's composure instantly shattered into outright shock. He screamed internally, confirming his intense hatred for liver, a food he found unbearably pungent. This aversion stemmed from his past life, where the overworked salaryman was forced to eat it all during client entertainment. The aspiring charismatic tyrant blinked, the memory of his corporate trauma fading back into the present. Then a sudden strategic idea flashed across the mind of the reincarnated player. The aspiring tyrant slammed his hand onto the table, shattering the moment of peace. Rising abruptly, Lucille declared the extravagant dish worthless. The reincarnated player glared, demanding to know who dared present such a crude item before him. The head chef, utterly bewildered, protested that Lord Klaus himself had requested this delicacy. Lucille paused, a flicker of confusion crossing his face as he wondered if the original Klaus's memories were interfering. The latent talent realized the conflict between his own memory and that of his predecessor. Ignoring the chef's explanation, the young noble called out to his steward, Oliver, denying any such instruction. The aspiring villain commanded Oliver to immediately imprison the chef and anyone involved in the procurement for 1 week. The terrified chef pleaded desperately for Lord Klaus to reconsider his harsh judgment. Even the loyal steward Oliver stepped forward, suggesting this behavior was perhaps excessively tyrannical. Oliver, still concerned, tried to rationalize the chef's actions, insisting there was no malice intended toward Lord Klaus. The reincarnated player rejected the defense, declaring that if anyone did intend harm, this punishment would be far too lenient. Raising a commanding hand, the young noble warned that defiance would be met with a thorough and unforgettable lesson. Lucille cut off further protest, reminding his steward that this was an absolute command that demanded silent obedience. Oliver, defeated, bowed his head and acknowledged the harsh order. A small, satisfied smirk touched the aspiring tyrant's lips. Turning his back on the dining hall, Klaus strode away, leaving the matter settled. The powerful young man walked across the vast floor, basking in the silence his absolute authority had created. He inwardly celebrated, convinced this arbitrary cruelty was finally the villainous act he needed. Meanwhile, the unfortunate chef remained collapsed on the floor, utterly crushed by the week-long sentence. Oliver watched the crushed chef, still processing the Duke's extreme command. The loyal steward recognized this level of irrationality was far beyond the young noble's usual eccentricities. He considered the immense difficulty involved in finding a merchant who could even supply red dragon liver. This was an ingredient so rare and valuable that its freshness was considered paramount. Yet the steward could not recall any recent reports of a red dragon being slain in the nearby territories. If the meat was not fresh, Oliver wondered exactly where this particular liver had been procured. Reflecting on the Duke's warning about malice, a terrifying possibility began to dawn on the advisor. With sudden dread, he reached out to test the suspicious delicacy himself. Ignoring protocol, the loyal servant took a bite, needing to confirm his growing suspicion. The taste hit him like a physical blow. The red dragon liver was unequivocally rotten. 1 week passed, and the aspiring tyrant felt certain his calculated malice had successfully accumulated charisma points. A knock came at the door, and his loyal steward Oliver requested an audience. The steward entered, immediately bringing up the matter concerning the red dragon liver incident. Lucille recalled the staff he had arbitrarily tossed into the jail for a week, confirming his tyrannical decree had been followed. Oliver bowed deeply, praising the young master for having seen through the scheme from the very beginning. The charismatic tyrant, however, was utterly confused by the praise, asking what the steward meant. The steward explained that the delicacy was not red dragon liver at all, but the liver of a far less valuable hungry bird. The chefs had used illusionary magic to disguise the cheap meat, attempting to pass it off as the rare dragon delicacy. Oliver was overwhelmed, realizing that the young noble's seemingly irrational command had actually saved the household from a massive fraud. Lucille, the alleged genius, screamed internally. His accidental righteousness had once again completely undermined his evil plan. The captured fraudster, already bound, confessed that he assumed the young noble was too ignorant to spot the cheap substitute. Lucille stared, realizing the gravity of the situation. This level of fraud usually meant immediate execution. The young master Klaus declared his sentence: confiscation of all assets and forced, unpaid labor for the household as penance. Oliver beamed, explaining that for a merchant, financial ruin and forced labor was a fate far exceeding mere execution. The loyal steward then presented the master with something else he wished to deliver. The staff, released from their week-long confinement, were overwhelmingly grateful, offering letters of profound thanks to the genius. Lucille, the accidental hero, could only stare in exasperation. Why was he receiving gratitude from the people he had tried to punish? Word spread quickly among the staff about Lord Klaus's discerning eye, which saw through illusion, and his surprisingly generous treatment of his subordinates. The news spread to the territory, where the commoners' support for the Renford household exploded, celebrating the lord who crushed the swindlers. Oliver, the loyal steward, looked upon his master with sincere devotion, overjoyed to serve a genius whose every action was perfect. Having delivered his glowing report, the devoted steward Oliver respectfully took his leave. But the reincarnated player felt his resolve physically shaking at the results. The aspiring charismatic tyrant slumped to the floor, overwhelmed by the unintended consequences of his actions. All his efforts were meticulously calculated to force the ultimate antagonist, Duke Furashiel, into existence. Yet every attempt at malice only cemented his reputation as a terrifyingly effective, righteous noble. The title of Charisma of Evil was being forcefully replaced by the glittering label of Benevolent Lord. Lucille realized he was now dangerously far from achieving true villainous charisma. After only 2 weeks in the role of Klaus, the protagonist's infamy had vanished, replaced by overwhelming public support. "What terrible misfortune," the frustrated noble muttered, glaring intensely. To stop this righteous flow and return to the path of wickedness, a new drastic action was required. To enact his new plan, the aspiring tyrant donned a cloak for a secret field investigation. The protagonist smirked, pleased that the simple disguise lent him the perfect air of mystery. His gaze sharpened, preparing to observe the commoners without the filter of his staff. The quiet rooftops of the domain offered a mundane view of the territory. The disguised lord walked the cobblestone streets, observing the daily lives of his subjects. He realized that despite his recent duties, his understanding of the territory's economy and social life remained critically underdeveloped. The overall atmosphere was subdued. This, he noted, was the true current state of the Renford domain. The reincarnated player considered that if the central town was this poor, the outlying regions must be truly miserable. Suddenly, a wicked smile broke through. This widespread misery must surely be breeding resentment toward their lord. The self-proclaimed charisma of evil decided that reports of skyrocketing support were merely Oliver's exaggerated claims, even as the steward's image confirmed the opposite. Lucille, cloaked and hidden, watched the impoverished streets, searching for signs of genuine malice. Instead, the aspiring tyrant witnessed a merchant violently seize a ragged young boy, accusing him of stealing goods. The desperate child was caught red-handed, clutching a piece of fruit intended for his family. Pleading for mercy, the boy explained he had no food to feed his younger siblings. The cruel merchant mocked him, declaring the fruit was meant only for the lord's use and demanding the child eat weeds. Nearby, the reincarnated player overheard citizens lamenting the lack of security and the growing desperation of the poor. As the merchant escalated the abuse by stepping on the boy, the crowd's sympathy solidified into resentment, directed entirely at the wealthy man. The self-proclaimed charisma of evil sighed, realizing that even this display of wickedness was failing to generate the popular hatred he desired. He concluded that if he wanted to see true, calculated evil, he would have to provide it himself. The young victim looked up, startled, as the hidden noble prepared to unleash his accidental brand of justice. The cloak dropped, and the crowd instantly recognized the terrifying face of their young lord, Klaus Renford. As the accidental tyrant approached the scene, the onlookers wondered if he was about to deliver salvation. The self-proclaimed charisma of evil loomed over the petty merchant and his victim. With a cold, frustrated expression, the reincarnated player prepared to unleash his calculated malice. The starving boy smiled, completely misinterpreting the terrifying intent behind the noble's gaze. But Lucille's words were not of salvation. He coldly declared that useless existence was unwanted in his territory. The terrified child, still believing the Lord was punishing him for stealing, begged for mercy. The accidental hero's eyes narrowed, channeling the overwhelming magical power he had inherited. With a flick of his wrist, the powerful mage cast the formidable wind prison spell. The vortex of wind instantly seized its target, delivering the swift, brutal justice of the benevolent Lord. The powerful wind prison instantly seized its target, violently tossing the terrified merchant. The surrounding citizens gasped, witnessing the terrifying, absolute power of Lord Klaus Renford. The accidental tyrant reveled in the moment, convinced this display would cement his reputation as a cruel, self-serving noble. The ragged young boy, still reeling from the shock, watched the scene unfold. Even while imprisoned, the corrupt merchant mentally boasted about the high-class fruits he supplied to the nobility. This, the reincarnated player mused, was a golden opportunity to finally generate the hatred he required. The crowd below stared up, utterly silent as the accidental tyrant prepared his next move. Lord Klaus Renford fixed the crowd with a cold gaze, daring anyone to voice a complaint. Instead of resentment, the citizens were overcome by the fear of their terrifyingly righteous lord. The determined villain smiled, completely unaware that his calculated cruelty had once again been interpreted as absolute, flawless justice. The accidental tyrant declared that such acts of cruelty would never be tolerated in his domain. Lucille internally cheered, convinced he had just earned 100 points of pure, malicious charisma. He calculated that his reputation as a self-serving noble was finally taking a hit. Suddenly, the commotion drew the attention of a fully armored city guard patrol. The young lord noted the perfect timing of the patrol's arrival. Pointing to the vortex of wind, Klaus Renford instructed them to handle the criminal once the spell dissipated in 5 minutes. With a dismissive gesture, the noble told the guards to consult a stray dog if they had further questions. He turned and draped his cloak over his shoulder, leaving the bewildered knights to process the sudden display of power. Lucille mused that while the wind prison was non-lethal, he still felt uneasy about the idea of killing a child. Regardless, the protagonist was certain that leaving the scene in disarray would only further cement his reputation as a cruel, arbitrary noble. Lucille, the accidental tyrant, walked away laughing, convinced he had finally earned the malicious charisma he desperately craved. Behind him, the city guard patrol stared in awe at the immense, swirling vortex of the wind prison. A bewildered citizen approached the armored officer, asking what exactly had just transpired in the square. The knight explained that the lord had used powerful magic on a merchant who was abusing a starving child caught stealing. The guard internally mused that such a swift, severe punishment seemed disproportionate to the small crime. But then the officer realized the lord's true intention. The wind prison was about to dissipate, leaving the criminal perfectly restrained for capture. As the magical winds vanished, the guards rushed forward to secure the merchant and check on the surrounding citizens. The nearby commoners looked stunned, realizing the full extent of the lord's terrifying, non-lethal power. The merchant, now freed, lay sprawled on the cobblestones, disoriented and yelling, demanding to know who had attacked him. The man scrambled up, confused as to why he was suddenly outside, and frantically asked where the stolen child had gone. The city guard patrol, rushing to secure the merchant, suddenly halted in shock. They realized the man was none other than Garou the White Shadow, a major member of the notorious Crimson Crime Organization. The captured criminal had been in hiding for months, believing his disguise was flawless. The guards were baffled as to why such a high-profile target was caught in such a trivial public manner. Lord Renford, the young noble, simply stated that the criminal was secured and the rest was up to them. The guards exchanged stunned glances, remembering how the benevolent lord had previously exposed the massive red dragon liver fraud. A few days later, Lucille heard the news. The entire Crimson Crime Organization was being dismantled as a result of the capture. The common people rejoiced, relieved that the streets were now safe for shopping and travel. The frustrated protagonist mused that perhaps joining a crime organization would be the best way to cultivate his desired evil charisma. Eager to confirm the damage to his reputation, the accidental tyrant decided to check the public reaction, anticipating widespread hatred and fear. Instead of hatred, the accidental tyrant was met with the beaming smiles of grateful commoners. The entire city rejoiced in the safety brought by their terrifyingly effective new ruler. The frustrated protagonist could only stare, utterly bewildered by the outcome. Before he could process the failure, a city guard urgently approached the young noble. Kneeling in respect, the guard reported the complete and successful dismantling of the entire Crimson Organization. Still reeling, Lucille wondered what connection his arbitrary display of power had to this massive operation. The guard clarified that the cruel merchant, captured by the young lord, was far more than he appeared. The supposed merchant was actually Garou the White Shadow, a high-ranking executive of Crimson using flawless illusion magic. The accidental tyrant stared in horror, realizing his calculated malice was perceived as perfect foresight. A terrifying sense of déjà vu washed over him. Because he saw through the disguise, the city was now free from the organized thefts that had plagued the streets for months. The swift capture of Garou led to the immediate interrogation and dismantling of the entire Crimson network. The commoners rejoiced, with even the youngest citizens praising the Lord's terrifying efficiency. They celebrated the Lord's absolute declaration, "Your existence is unnecessary in my domain." This swift, non-lethal justice was seen as the perfect, unwavering promise to protect his people. The accidental tyrant, internally horrified, was externally hailed as a hero who would never allow his subjects to be harmed. Overwhelmed by gratitude, the citizens pressed in, shouting their devotion to the Lord who had freed them from crime. Lucille stared in wide-eyed horror, swearing internally at the catastrophic failure of his calculated malice. "Why did this happen?" the accidental tyrant wailed, completely bewildered by his inability to cultivate even a shred of evil charisma. Back at the estate, a maid paused, perhaps noticing the unusual calm in the streets. Lucille finally returned to the manor, staggering in shock, as Oliver and the staff happily welcomed the hero home. Lucille, still reeling from his accidental heroism, immediately complained to Oliver about having to run errands himself. The loyal steward explained that the item was stored in a chamber, only accessible by those who carried the Renford bloodline. Oliver's eyes gleamed, suggesting there was more to this simple task than met the eye. The education advisor then pointed out the mountain of accumulated duties from the 3 days the young master had spent recovering from his shock. Steward Oliver proudly stated that he had flawlessly handled all the responsibilities in the accidental tyrant's absence. Thanks to the steward's efforts, the minor noble had managed to rule the domain without issue since his parents' passing. Lucille gritted his teeth, knowing he currently had no rebuttal to the man's undeniable competence. The frustrated protagonist internally swore that soon he would demonstrate overwhelming, absolute evil to the entire world. Before he could dwell on his dark plans, a sudden high-pitched shriek cut through the air. Both men immediately turned toward the sound, Oliver asking Klaus what disturbance had just occurred. The minor noble immediately shifted his gaze toward the commotion. Approaching the scene, the accidental tyrant spotted a terrified maid in the corridor. Her reaction was immediate, eyes wide with sheer panic upon realizing the terrifying presence of her master. Trembling, she immediately dropped into a deep bow, desperately begging forgiveness. The frustrated protagonist observed her reaction with calculated intensity. The only damage was a wooden bucket lying on its side, water slowly spreading across the polished stone. Lucille misinterpreted her shaking as a sign that his terrifying reputation was finally cultivating the desired evil charisma. Yet even the minor noble had to admit that this level of terror seemed disproportionate to a simple spill. The reincarnated player paused, realizing her excessive reaction might stem from something deeper than just dropping a bucket. He suddenly recalled the lore. Her black hair marked her as a target of deep-seated prejudice in the Salscha kingdom, explaining her overwhelming dread. The reincarnated player remembered the game's heroine, also black-haired, who constantly struggled against such deep-seated prejudice. The maid, startled by his silence, tentatively called out to the young lord. But the accidental tyrant dismissed the lore, declaring he must now deliver a punishment to cultivate his desired evil charisma. He quickly retracted the dramatic gesture, stating that public duty took precedence over his current impulse, and ordered her back to work. The relieved maid quickly affirmed his command, grateful that the terrifying lord had spared her. Lucille then turned and walked away, signaling to Oliver that they should depart immediately. Yet the minor noble found himself still preoccupied by the black-haired girl. The protagonist wondered why he had no memory of such a visually distinct person, working within his own manor. His steward Oliver smoothly supplied the answer, confirming her name was Mary and that she was a long-serving maid of the Renford house. The bewildered player stared at the steward, questioning why he had never seen her before in all his time inhabiting Klaus Renford. The loyal steward explained that Mary was fundamentally assigned only minimal duties. She was restricted to simple cleaning tasks far from the manor's central areas, preventing the young lord from ever noticing her. The accidental tyrant stared, utterly bewildered by the concept of a servant being given so little work. Oliver confirmed that Mary was essentially a maid who was allowed to slack off, a concept that immediately piqued Lucille's interest. This reminded the player of the conniving coworkers from his past life, who excelled at pushing work onto others and flattering their superiors. If Mary was truly such an existence, Oliver suggested that the Lord would need to issue a formal punishment. The steward added that her situation was unique compared to the rest of the household staff due to other circumstances. Lucille, suddenly suspicious, demanded to know if she was living separately, realizing he had overlooked this basic detail. The calculating noble immediately commanded Oliver to retrieve the complete floor plan of the manor. Checking the layout, the protagonist confirmed that Mary was indeed utilizing an isolated room all by herself. The accidental tyrant pondered the implications of Mary's isolated living situation, much to Oliver's concern. He realized the original Klaus's negligent parents had allowed this solitary arrangement to persist. Worse, despite the parents' evil reputation, Mary had been treated with unexpected kindness and special care. This was unacceptable. Lucille raged internally, realizing this special treatment was undermining his entire campaign for evil charisma. The calculating noble immediately commanded Oliver to inform Mary to gather only her necessities and wait outside the manor. Oliver, the loyal steward, bowed deeply, submitting to the sudden excessive tyranny of his young master. But the protagonist paused, wondering why he had suddenly become so intensely motivated by this minor detail. He decided it was best if he also distanced himself from the area for a moment. The reincarnated player suddenly looked up, his eyes widening in surprise at the ensuing chaos. Standing outside the manor with Mary and Oliver, Lucille stared at the grand structure, utterly confused by the result of his own arbitrary command. The minor noble stared at the grand structure, realizing it was far more luxurious than the apartment he had in his previous life. He grumbled internally, still annoyed by the accidental success of his previous calculated malice. Mary, the dutiful maid, confirmed she had followed his arbitrary command and retrieved the necessary items. Oliver, his loyal steward, stepped forward, asking the young lord what exactly he planned to do next. The frustrated tyrant looked up sharply, demanding to know what they thought he was doing. He instructed them to watch closely, preparing for his next calculated move toward villainy. Lucille raised his hand dramatically, declaring that this display was his definitive answer. The reincarnated player unleashed a devastating torrent of arcane power, manifesting the formidable storm of destruction. The immense vortex tore into the manor, instantly reducing the grand structure to a chaotic pile of stone and debris. The accidental hero stared coldly at the ruins, convinced this act of arbitrary destruction would finally generate the necessary evil charisma. Oliver, the loyal steward, watched in stunned silence as a maid prepared to evacuate the destroyed manor. The young servant was utterly dumbfounded by the sudden arbitrary violence that had just leveled the annex. Her expression reflected the sheer terror of witnessing such raw, destructive power unleashed by her master. Lucille, the accidental tyrant, simply confirmed the obvious when questioned about the source of the chaos. Pointing to the massive pile of rubble that was once the annex, he declared their residency here was over. The maid nervously processed the fact that her master had just destroyed her home without warning. She lowered her head, absorbing the weight of this sudden, inexplicable displacement. The young master insisted that this cruel treatment was nothing special, merely a display of his absolute whim. The worried servant asked what fate awaited her now that her personal quarters were gone. The accidental hero calmly informed her that she would naturally be sharing a room with the other maids. The maid stared, perhaps realizing the full extent of the young master's arbitrary power. The accidental tyrant sternly pointed, declaring that she would now participate in all manner duties, with zero tolerance for laziness. She nervously gripped her hands, trying to understand the deeper meaning of this sudden, harsh reassignment. The frustrated noble finished his decree, instructing Oliver to handle the details before walking away. He mused happily, convinced that her tearful reaction confirmed the success of his latest attempt at cultivating evil charisma. The young master continued his stride, unaware of the true consequences of his actions. Clutching her luggage, the maid stood alone in the ruins, ready to begin her new life of shared labor. This was Mary, and her past was marked by prejudice. As a child, she and her mother shared the burden of having black hair. To eliminate this deep-seated bias, the royal family had specifically instructed nobles to actively employ those with black hair. It was at age 12 that Mary's mother was hired by the Renford family for favor, and the two were given the small, run-down room that Lucille just destroyed. Despite the royal decree, Mary's mother was overworked, and her already weak body eventually succumbed to illness. Mary replaced her mother, but the Renford family only gave the black-haired maid meaningless tasks to satisfy the royal quota. Trapped by her circumstances, the young maid couldn't understand her reason for staying and lacked the courage to leave the manor. That small annex room became a curse, binding Mary to the painful memory of her mother's last moments. She clung to her mother's last promise, that Mary would one day leave this place and see the wider world. But Mary felt she couldn't fulfill that promise, crying out in loneliness for her mother to take her away. A comforting hand reached out, offering gentle reassurance that everything would be all right. A savior would surely appear, the voice promised, someone who would take her away from this suffocating existence. Yet she never truly believed those words, knowing the previous lord would never even notice her existence. So why then did the new lord, the terrifyingly effective Klaus Renford, destroy the very room that contained the last remnants of her past? The accidental tyrant stood in the servant quarters, a place Klaus Renford would never normally frequent. Before him the terrified maid bowed low, offering desperate apologies for her mere existence. Yet even as she swept the floor, she recalled the rumors that the new lord was now a benevolent master, filled with compassion. The benevolent lord, meanwhile, was surrounded by the overwhelming, accidental consequences of his swift, terrifying justice. The young woman dared a glance upward, seeing the terrifying efficiency of the man who had destroyed her past. In her heart, a desperate, silent question formed: could this terrifying ruler truly be her savior? Lucille, driven by his need to appear arbitrarily cruel, issued a sweeping command. She would join the other staff and work the entire manor. To the protagonist's utter confusion, the maid accepted this arbitrary decree with a relieved smile, promising to fulfill her duties. Oliver, the loyal steward, approached, confirming the maid's name was Mary and expressing relief she was finally free of that suffocating room. Wiping away tears of genuine happiness, Mary confirmed that the manor staff had already treated her with kindness. Mary, the newly freed maid, offered her deepest thanks for the chance to live normally with the others. Oliver, the loyal steward, confirmed that Lord Klaus had specifically decreed she only take the bare minimum necessary possessions. Yet the steward ensured she did not forget any cherished mementos or important belongings. The dedicated steward quickly deflected her thanks, insisting that the credit belonged elsewhere. Mary looked up, realizing that her true master was none other than the terrifyingly effective Lord Klaus. To her, the accidental tyrant was a great and benevolent ruler, worthy of her absolute, lifelong devotion. With genuine tears of joy, the maid swore her allegiance to the man who had unknowingly saved her. Meanwhile, the protagonist, Lucille, was utterly aghast at the catastrophic failure of his latest attempt at arbitrary cruelty. He sensed a strange, cold atmosphere around him, wondering if his latent power was still not fully under control. Despite the accidental righteousness, the frustrated villain convinced himself this was a successful step, already plotting his next move to finally generate some genuine hatred. The scene shifts abruptly to a dark, torchlit stone corridor deep within a dungeon. Meanwhile, an adventurer named Gen reacted with utter disbelief to the escalating danger. His companion, a young priestess, knelt in distress beside a fallen comrade. The cause of their terror was a monstrous mutated ogre, radiating immense, volatile power. Gen realized their routine dungeon raid had gone catastrophically wrong. This sudden, terrifying mutation meant the dungeon boss was far stronger than any known threat. The creature had evolved into a high ogre boss, having consumed other monsters and adapted to the changing environment. One strike had knocked out their ally, forcing Gen to shoulder the burden of escape against a foe whose power had rapidly spiked. Desperate, the survivors retreated, the priestess crying out for the guild to send immediate assistance. Using powerful transmission magic, the plea for rescue was broadcast across the city. The priestess worried aloud, questioning if the guild even had the fighting power needed to confront the high ogre. Still, she screamed, desperation overriding logic. They had encountered an abnormal boss deep within the dungeon, and they could not abandon their fallen comrades. Praying the message reached the guild safely, the light faded from the dungeon entrance. Gen gripped his sword, knowing that until help arrived, the burden fell solely on him. The adventurer charged the massive ogre, determined to buy precious time at any cost. Meanwhile, back at the manor, the accidental tyrant sat calmly, already planning his next calculated act of malice. He tapped the documents detailing the city's recent affairs, his mind focused on cultivating evil charisma. The young noble mused that if he truly intended to provoke the ultimate villain, strength was a non-negotiable requirement. Since his reincarnation, Klaus Renford had diligently trained his swordsmanship and arcane arts, but recently his growth felt frustratingly stagnant. The reincarnated player knew the rules of this world. Skill mastery was ultimately capped by character level. To break through his frustrating stagnation, the accidental tyrant realized there was only one definitive answer. The classic solution, Lucille declared with fierce determination, we must defeat monsters and raid a dungeon. Leaving his baffled steward, Oliver, behind, the young noble rushed out of the manor, scattering documents in his wake. Soon, Klaus Renford was traversing the wilderness, his sword secured and ready for action. The meta-knowledge user was confident, having already researched this low-level dungeon and knowing he could clear it without issue. But as he approached the entrance, his sharp eyes noticed a sudden, unexpected movement. Something was flying rapidly through the trees toward the unsuspecting noble. Without hesitation, the master of latent power gripped the hilt and began drawing his blade. In a flash of steel, Lucille executed a powerful, preemptive strike against the unseen threat. The accidental tyrant successfully intercepted the attack, but the result was not what he expected. What fell to the forest floor was not a monster, but a strange, glowing blue bird construct. The noble bent down, recognizing the faint magical residue tied to the word, dungeon. The message contained a desperate plea for a comrade, asking someone to work for them. Lucille realized this was a form of transmission magic, a magical flyer used to recruit members. The preemptive strike of the latent swordsman had successfully severed the message before it could reach its intended target. Shaking off the minor guilt, the frustrated villain reminded himself that cultivating evil charisma meant not caring about such trivial details. Ahead of him lay the dark, moss-covered entrance to the dungeon. Before stepping into the depths, the calculating player paused to prepare for the coming challenge. He equipped the B-rank Ring of Recoil Enhancement, a relic that promised immense power in exchange for a continuous, deadly drain on his life force. The benevolent lord then retrieved another item, the D-rank Blood Lure Lamp designed to summon surrounding monsters. The calculating player knew that fighting high-level enemies solo, while maintaining low HP, was the most efficient way to level up. Using the recoil ring to intentionally lower his vitality was merely a basic technique for maximizing experience gain. Ironically, this dangerous lure was among the items confiscated during the accidental dismantling of the Crimson Organization. Lucille dismissed the risk, confident that his meta-knowledge of the game world would negate any danger. The accidental tyrant applied the potent, crimson liquid to his armor, declaring his preparations complete. Instantly, the dark depths responded, and a horde of monstrous eyes converged on the dungeon entrance. The young noble met the terrifying surge of enemies with a cold, unwavering gaze. Drawing his blade, he engaged the first charging goblin in swift, decisive melee combat. Even while fighting close range, Klaus Renford began channeling the immense arcane power he possessed. The immense arcane power he channeled erupted in a blinding, devastating blast. His blade, slick with the blood of the immediate threats, confirmed the swiftness of his close-quarters skill. Standing over the pile of defeated monsters, the young noble felt the familiar, unwelcome sensation of a level-up. Lucille, the accidental tyrant, mused internally that he might become addicted to this rapid gain of strength. Having cleared the path, Klaus decided it was a good time to head home after dealing with the final boss in the room ahead. He paused, taking a moment to gather his composure before the final confrontation. But then the sound of battle echoed from the boss chamber. Had another party already arrived? The reincarnated player sighed, realizing his calculated exit was about to be delayed. His expression hardened. Someone was trying to steal the kill, and that was unacceptable. The noble heir strode forward, determined to confront whoever dared challenge his claim to the ogre boss. The reincarnated player stopped, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. This ogre boss seemed significantly larger than the meta-knowledge had suggested. The monstrous creature roared, confirming the difference between the game and reality. Regardless, the accidental tyrant focused his gaze. Leveling up remained the highest priority. Klaus Renford raised his hand, channeling immense arcane power into a destructive spell. The resulting blast of flame and wind was far greater than he had intended, shaking the very ground. The massive ogre boss stared in shock as the overwhelming force struck its armored hide. The concentrated magical energy completely engulfed the target in a blinding flash. The noble heir smiled, giving a satisfied thumbs up for the successful, if overpowered, subjugation. Internally, Lucille realized the impact of his recent level-up had drastically enhanced the spell's destructive power. The sheer magical force left onlookers reeling, demanding to know the source of such terrifying power. They saw the noble heir standing illuminated in the gate, realizing he was the one who had swiftly defeated the crime boss. Panic seized the remaining criminals as they recognized the figure, realizing the full extent of the disaster. The accidental tyrant looked down upon them, his identity as Lord Klaus Renford confirmed to the terrified masses. Ignoring the pleas to stop, the young noble simply walked away, leaving the city to process the swift, terrifying justice. Internally, Lucille smirked, believing this public display of overwhelming power would finally generate the necessary hatred. He wanted to be seen as the lowest kind of villain, stealing spoils and spreading a terrible reputation among the adventurers. The frustrated hero laughed maniacally, convinced that casually defeating monsters and acting arbitrarily was the most efficient path to evil charisma. Meanwhile, the adventurers Lucille had saved were recounting their desperate battle against a sudden mutated monster, having used up all their resources. They concluded that the Lord's intervention, though terrifyingly swift, had been a perfectly timed rescue from the brink of death. The grateful adventurers celebrated, emphasizing that the Lord sought no reward or recognition for his terrifying intervention. The wounded man wept, convinced that the benevolent Lord had used powerful transmission magic to rush to their aid, risking his own life. The party's healer confirmed the sacrifice, noting that the Lord's HP was critically low, yet he pushed past his limits to save them. They marveled at the recklessness of the young noble, who would risk everything for mere outcasts like themselves. Throughout the city, people discussed how Klaus Renford, the minor noble, had suddenly become a terrifyingly righteous ruler. His swift justice had brought genuine peace and security to the domain. They raised their mugs high, declaring the accidental tyrant a greater and more magnificent noble than any other lord in the realm. The tale of the Lord's heroism spread through the guild, until dawn, inspiring tears of profound gratitude among all the adventurers. Back at the manor, the subject of this intense adoration suddenly let out a massive sneeze. The frustrated protagonist mused, wondering aloud if someone was finally spreading the bad rumors he desperately needed. The frustrated protagonist laughed maniacally, convinced his public display of malice was finally generating the hatred he needed. A few days passed quickly within the Renford estate. Lucille focused entirely on his next move to cultivate evil charisma. The future powerhouse had maximized his current potential, reaching the absolute limit of the nearby training grounds. The calculating genius sighed, deciding to temporarily shift his focus back to the mundane duties of the manor. However, his loyal steward, Oliver, interrupted the quiet with a nervous cough and an unexpected proposal. A private maid, the accidental tyrant questioned, wondering what scheme Oliver was cooking up now. Giving his consent, the young lord instructed the steward to bring the chosen servant forward. The newly appointed servant, Mary, stepped forward, pledging her sincere devotion and promising to fulfill all her master's expectations. Little did the benevolent lord know, this innocent addition to his staff would soon become another obstacle in his quest for true evil. The young lord still mused on his public display of power, convinced that the crowd must now harbor hatred for the terrifying tyrant. But the memory of the new maid, Mary, brought a fresh wave of suspicion. Why was she smiling so brightly when she volunteered for his service? The accidental tyrant narrowed his eyes, wondering what kind of scheme this seemingly innocent girl was truly plotting against him. Mary, meanwhile, began her duties, seamlessly providing the young lord with moments of peace and relaxation while he worked. Her service was impeccable, pouring tea with a quiet grace that was utterly disarming to the paranoid noble. Lucille struggled to determine how he could possibly leverage this new, perfectly competent servant into an act of genuine malice. Appointed by Oliver, the black-haired girl was now officially the exclusive maid dedicated solely to the service of Klaus Renford. The frustrated noble internally concluded that Mary's true objective must be revenge, a perfect opportunity for him to finally cultivate some evil charisma. Startled from his dark musings, the young lord looked up as Mary appeared, asking if he had called for her. Deciding to take charge, Lucille stood abruptly and instructed the new maid to follow him so he could personally teach her the duties of his exclusive servant. The accidental tyrant maintained his serious expression, ready to execute his plan for manufactured malice. Mary, startled by the abrupt demand, immediately submitted with a sharp affirmation. The young lord leaned in, internally daring the supposed spy to unleash whatever genius revenge plot she was hiding. He led her directly into the manor's expansive, well-stocked kitchen. Lucille began his instruction, declaring that cooking and preparing tea were the minimum required duties of his personal servant. The new maid offered a quick, calculating glance before accepting the task. She immediately reached for the ingredients, selecting eggs and bacon from the counter. Observing her movements, the noble smiled, convinced that her lack of practice proved she had been slacking off on her true evil mission. Mary, however, was focused entirely on the task, internally musing that she held no interest in the craft of cooking itself. Yet the supposed vengeful spy followed his instructions precisely, questioning only why she allowed herself to perform such menial tasks. The supposed spy attacked the ingredients with surprising, focused intensity. The accidental tyrant was certain this forced labor was building up unbearable stress in his target. He laughed internally, waiting for the moment she would snap and reveal her true wicked intentions. Instead, the kitchen staff were patiently and harmoniously instructing Mary on the delicate art of cooking. The minor noble realized this cooperative atmosphere was completely undermining his attempt to generate hostility. With an unexpected smile, Mary presented the finished dish to her master. The accidental tyrant took his seat and began sampling the results of her forced labor. He chewed thoughtfully, conceding that the meal was surprisingly edible, albeit due to the professional guidance. Yet the reincarnated player knew he could not offer praise, lest he accidentally cement his reputation for kindness again. He concluded that to truly provoke her, he must assign her a completely different, unbearable task. The frustrated noble quickly issued his next command, demanding immediate obedience. The maid Mary was officially appointed assistant steward, holding the documents detailing her new, overwhelming duties. Despite the heavy workload, she tackled the mountain of laundry with surprising cheerfulness. Next, she moved on to meticulously cleaning the entirety of the young lord's private chambers. The calculating player observed her, realizing his immense, calculated cruelty had failed to generate any anger or resentment. Deciding to escalate, the accidental tyrant declared this failure would now become a long-term plan. The young master pointed directly, confirming she would repeat the exact same unbearable tasks the following day. He smiled smugly, convinced this slow, grinding tyranny would finally accumulate the necessary stress and resentment. Mary looked down, clutching her hands in front of her, seemingly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of this commitment. Yet she looked up with a radiant smile, declaring she was honored to be the young lord's newly appointed, exclusive maid. The newly appointed maid beamed, expressing her sincere happiness at serving the young lord. Yet she confessed a slight anxiety about whether she could truly fulfill the duties of an exclusive attendant. Her first assignment was cooking, a task she revealed was strictly forbidden to her during the former lord's time. Despite her lack of skill, she bravely took up the challenge to satisfy the accidental tyrant's demands. The resulting dish, completed with the chef's assistance, was clearly imperfect, slightly charred in places. The young master, Klaus Renford, consumed the entire plate without a single word of complaint or praise. This simple act of consumption filled Mary with overwhelming joy, as no one had ever eaten her cooking before. Beyond cooking, she was entrusted with the intimate tasks of cleaning the room and managing the protagonist's personal affairs. The maid understood that failure in any of these tasks would have resulted in immediate dismissal from her coveted new role. The frustrated tyrant simply looked up and commanded her to repeat the exact same duties starting tomorrow. The maid closed the door, calling out to her master one last time. She felt honored, believing the benevolent lord had placed his absolute trust in her. She asked if she could continue to serve Klaus Renford, ready to meet his expectations. With a radiant smile, the dedicated servant swore to exceed the expectations of her terrifyingly effective master. Meanwhile, the frustrated tyrant resolved to pile on even more overwhelming tasks, starting the very next day. Time passed quickly, and soon the maid returned, presenting the day's tea service. Lucille noted that Mary's quality of service, from the meals to the tea, had inexplicably improved under the chef's guidance. He wanted to be moved by her earnest dedication, but the accidental tyrant knew better than to trust appearances. Instead, the paranoid protagonist immediately imagined her true self, a vengeful assassin preparing to slip poison into his cup. Since this was now a long-term threat, Klaus decided to use the potential assassination attempts to hone his reaction skills for the inevitable confrontation with the ultimate villain. The accidental tyrant maintained his magical resistance to status effects while sipping the tea prepared by his supposed future assassin. Days of exposure had paid off. The reincarnated player found he could now neutralize most common poisons with ease. With his self-imposed training complete, the young noble turned his attention back to the mountain of administrative paperwork. But a single, heavily sealed envelope stood out among the routine documents. The minor noble paused, recognizing the sender's name, Duke Wyndham. This was Duke Wyndham, a major sub-character from Artina Fantasy and a noble known as the King's Blade. The character was popular among players, distinguished by the eye patch he wore to hide a past injury. Wyndham was an ally who helped the original protagonists dismantle the shadowy organization known as the Hand of Illusion. The accidental tyrant realized the letter was an invitation to celebrate the Duke's 10th anniversary in office. After a moment of cold calculation, Lucille determined there was absolutely no benefit to accepting the invitation. The accidental tyrant mused on the futility of attending the Duke's party as a maid approached with refreshments. She quickly retreated to fetch a refill of the tea. But a sudden slip caused the tray to fly, scattering the porcelain and hot liquid. The young noble watched the teacup hurtle toward his desk. The hot beverage crashed down, narrowly missing the crucial documents. Lucille smiled, interpreting the clumsy accident as a highly sophisticated, heat-based assassination attempt. The self-proclaimed villain immediately concluded that his enemies were shifting from poison to thermal warfare. Meanwhile, the terrified maid trembled, staring at the man she had just accidentally soaked. She desperately apologized, accepting full responsibility for the unforgivable failure. The calculating noble calmly noted that the spilled tea had ruined the Duke's invitation letter. The calculating noble's eyes widened as a truly wicked idea sparked in his mind. Lucille, the accidental tyrant, grinned, announcing that he had devised the perfect scheme. Meanwhile, the trembling maid braced herself for the expected punishment of confinement or lashing. The young master quickly cut her off, clarifying that her punishment was not the point of this opportunity. Instead, he held up the tea-stained document, declaring his intention to send the ruined invitation back to the Duke. This act of calculated disrespect, he mused, would surely spread his terrible reputation across the entire kingdom. He magnanimously forgave the maid, but she only saw this as further proof of her lord's terrifying, absolute genius.